Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our live broadcast of Teach Today Q&A, sponsored by the Toni Jennings Exceptional Education Institute, located at the University of Central Florida. We are broadcasting live over Facebook and YouTube. I am your moderator, Dr. Deshawn Chapman. I am the Education Programs Manager in the Center for Higher Education Innovation at the University of Central Florida. Tonight's presentation is Universal Design for Learning. This is the final session for Teach Today Q&A, and we have saved the very best for last. All of the previous sessions have touched upon this very topic. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. Dr. James Basham is currently a professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Kansas. His research is focused on student learning in modern learning environments related to the application of UDL. He has served as a consultant and is a co-founder of the Global UDL Implementation Research Network, the UDL-IRN. Dr. Denise DeCoste is an occupational therapist and a special educator with 30 years experience in the field of assistive technology. She is the author of numerous books and chapters on assistive technology and chapters on assistive technology, and was instrumental in building awareness of universal design for learning across her district and in the systemic implementation of UDL in MCPS schools. She is the vice chair of the UDL IRN and provides professional development on upgrading assistive technology service delivery and on AT to support reading and writing. Mr. Brian Dean is an instructional designer and co-owner of Detour Professional Learning. He has experience designing professional learning around UDL as well as many other areas. He also has designed virtual learning environments and developed a unique UDL coaching system based on appreciative and autonological coaching matrices. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for being here. For our audience, if you have a question for the panelists, please type it into the comments and we will make every attempt to address it tonight. As we answer questions, please be aware that the responses are the panelists' views and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Toni Jennings Exceptional Education Institute. So with that, let's get started and dive right into our first question. So, audience, remember that UDL stands for Universal Design for Learning. So, panelists, can you please explain the goal of UDL?
You want to start that, Denise? Why don't you go ahead?
No, Jamie, you start.
So what you'll find out is we're all friendly with one another. We all know each other quite well. And the one thing that I guess our bios we didn't put in there is we all have association with CAST. So we just clarify that as well. So as well as being a professor at the University of Kansas, I'm also the Senior Director of Learning and Innovation at CAST. And so I kind of wear two hats. So I have kind of a really great job in that sort of manner. So, Brian is also at CAST. He's one of our innovation sort of specialists. He helps on the innovation side, and I can't remember all the great sort of. He does tons of great work. So we can't even talk and can't even name all of it. But then Denise is beyond just being an extraordinary sort of person who really kind of helped bring forth the UDL IRN. She's also on the board at CAST. And so we all kind of have that association. And for those who don't know, CAST is the founders of UDL. So I thought I would just clarify that just to be on the record, as you will. So to the first question, what is the goal of UDL?
Yeah, I thought you were saying all those nice things, brother, to skip around the question.
Yeah. Yeah, could be. I mean, so the goal of UDL could be really multifold, but the whole premise of UDL, very premise of UDL, is to design learning environments and learning experiences that really support students as expert learners. And so that's the primary goal. And I know that kind of sounds kind of wishy-washy in some ways, but I think throughout the hour, we'll talk more about it. And I guess Brian and Denise may have more to say.
Brian, you want to go next?
No, please, Denise, you. I'd
We're
rather
being
riff
so
off
polite
you.
with one another.
I'd rather riff off you and Jamie
Yeah,
than
right.
venture my own forward.
Well, like Jamie said, it really is about creating a learner-centered classroom in schools that promote and have a focus on equity, on access, on inclusion, and creating expert learners. And I think sometimes when we talk about UDL, it does sound like it is a very big umbrella. But I sometimes think it's sometimes good to know what it's not, right? So in painting a picture of what UDL is, I'm just going to mention a few things about what it's not. It's not when all of the desks are facing forward. It is it's not where the teacher is front and center the majority of the day. It is not where content and delivery are more of a focus than content and planning. It is not where all of students are expected to provide the same product or outcome. And one final comment, it is not where there is only one way to demonstrate achievement or proficiency.
Teachers
Right.
are often
go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Teachers are often asked to differentiate instruction in their classroom. So what's the difference between differentiation and UDL?
Are we saying the same order? Who wants to take it? We should have some signs.
Right?
Well, we haven't heard from you, Brian, and you were going to riff off of everybody else. So this
I know. So now I got to be, now I'm out front. So I think that, UDL is a design framework, right? And it is about front loading that design, right? And one of the big pieces of UDL is that variability in our students is something that we know exists. We know it exists, and we can guarantee that it exists, and as such, we can design for it. And I think that differentiation is something that happens more often to a group of students or to a classroom, as opposed to designing with. And oftentimes I think that differentiation happens after the fact, after something has happened, and you're like, oh, I got to scramble, and I gotta find a different way to kind of address issues and barriers that are both learning barriers, cultural barriers, social emotional barriers that exist within my classroom. I have to do that after, and I think that for me, UDL is really about intentionality. And how we look at intentionality and say, how do I intentionally design? Now, will you be able to 100% design for a student, for every student that you may have? I don't think you will. And so I think that differentiation is the thing that, like, they have to work together. And I intentionally design for these barriers that I know students are going to have, and I design for the variability that I see in students. But there's always, because it is variability, and because education at its very core is human-centered, like, there are going to be things that I don't see. And so then differentiation comes in and helps with that. And then that informs my design. So I think that they work well together, but I think that it is about intuition and intention, right? Like how those two pair up.
The other thing I'd say to add to that, because I think that's perfect, the other thing I would add is oftentimes in education, everything gets put on the back of the educators to do the work. And what's different about UDL from differentiation is about something you do in the classroom. And UDL as a whole is more than what happens in the classroom. It's really around a whole systems design, a whole systems way of thinking about student-centered learning and acceptance of variability from the very beginning. And so while we work with educators in supporting implementation in the classroom, oftentimes what we're really kind of focused on the side of that is really, what does it mean for the system? What's it mean for the central office? What's it mean for the types of technology and types of tools we adopt? What's it mean for the decision-making processes for the way students maybe move through classes in a high school or middle school, or all these sort of different factors play a role. And that really the one of the huge differences is that it kind of brings the district together around a vision of student-centered learning. and it provides the same vocabulary. So everyone's operating under that same vocabulary, and they can have real meaningful discussions around learner variability and barriers within the environment. And it takes accessibility and moves it to a whole different level, right? Because it moves it beyond just thinking about sensory accessibility to thinking about what's it mean to have accessibility in the day of COVID, and what are some things we have to do in that manner. So that's another aspect that's different. It's a systems level adoption.
I would, I love that you mentioned that, Jamie, because I think that oftentimes when we start talking about frameworks or guidelines or pieces, systems, those sorts of things, we think that UDL is something for students, but like the idea is that it encompasses many different pieces. It's absolutely it's something for students, but it's also something that frees up educators, right? And frees up educators to start designing the way that they, again, back to that intuition, the way that you feel you should design. This adds the framework to it to say that I'm intentionally designing that way. And then it allows systems to start having those great conversations that Jamie was talking about. And I think that, really UDL, one of the big pieces that I have found with UDL is that it starts sharing the power of classrooms and of learning with students, and treating kind of everybody as learners. Because oftentimes, especially in our current educational system, students aren't stakeholders in their own education, right? Like there's something that either they benefit from, or something or they don't benefit from. And I think that what UDL starts to say is how do you go about your learning? How do we work that together? And then how do I, as an educator, start to intentionally design that so that you can get what you need out of it, and you can get we can empower you with executive functioning and turn you into move you along the pathway of becoming an expert learner, but also how do you become a stakeholder in your own education and your own learning, and understanding that, how do you move that forward for the rest of your life? So, anyways, I'll let you jump in, Denise.
There you go.
I don't know. I thought that was beautiful. I have nothing to add to that. It was eloquent, both of you.
Well, you all have talked about planning using the UDL framework. I've heard plan, that it takes time, it takes intentionality. So my question is, does it take more time to design a lesson with UDL in mind than it might take to create a lesson without it?
It will initially, because you have to, in your planning process, you have to really think very seriously about what are the needs of your students, and what are the learning styles of your students, and how do they appear to learn best in the context of the topic that you're teaching in your classroom. So and you have to really understand have to have some sense of the UDL guidelines, and really begin to, as you create your lesson plans, to think about it upfront, proactively, as Brian described. You have to proactively plan with that in mind, and that will take longer at the beginning up front. Once teachers in our district, started doing it routinely, and we all would always say to them, listen, you don't need to kill yourself here. If you can get started with 1 or 2 new lesson plans a month, get started that way, or 1 or 2, even 1 a week would be great, right? That would be more perfect. But you'll need to move into this kind of at your own pace, and do what works for the students and the needs of your classroom. For example, you have to build in routines up front. You can't automatically sort of deliver a UDL lesson. It requires some routine building on the part of your students, and that requires planning on the part of an educator. So yes, it might take time up front, but what educators tell us, or told me in the past, once they really got into planning their lessons with a UDL frame of reference, within the UDL framework, they couldn't go back, and their students didn't want them to go back to doing it any other way. When the teacher would then pull out an old lesson and teach it in the way that she did before, the kids would call her on it. So
I think one of the things I was going to point out there, and she said the word learning styles, and it's not necessarily the style people are thinking about, generically thinking about the flexibility and design of the classroom.
Right.
And so, because oftentimes UDL gets associated with, oh, it's about this learning styles thing, which
No.
have empirical research around and
Right.
such. And
Mhm.
it's really not about that. But when you think about the types of students you have in your classroom and the types of variability associated with that, you have to think about the modes in which they're interacting and engaging within the environment. So it's not the traditional like
Yeah, it's not about whether they're a visual learner or
yeah,
not.
yeah,
This
it's
is
not
not what UDL is about.
I
No,
wanted
no,
to-
no, no.
wanted
But
to
there
clear-
are, as Brian said, there is a great deal of variability within every learner, and so you need to understand that variability within your learners.
And I don't know if it's more time. I do agree with Denise that in the beginning, if it not only do you perceive it as more time, but it it could be because you start from going one direction to zipping around and trying from another direction. But I think it's about allocation of time too, right? So if we really sit down and we think about how much time as educators we're chasing fires, right? And we're trying to put them out, and we're trying to mess with this lesson, and we're trying to do this. Like let's be honest. Like if you're an educator and your Sunday night is pretty much the same. Everybody has it, right? Like you are sitting in your office, i.e., the front room on your couch or the kitchen table, and you're planning out a unit, right? And then you're taking that unit, and then you're changing it as much as you need to once the fires start. That's a huge investment of time. UDL is not going to take more time than that. I caution educators because they're like, this is going to take me forever. I'm like, you're already spending forever because we're dedicated individuals, right? So you're already spending forever. But what you're spending a lot of your time on is chasing down those fires and trying to put out those fires when you really try to start to put together a UDL lesson. You're thinking about, how do I think about those fires before they become fires, right? Like how do I plan intentionally for those, and how do I front load my design? And at first it might feel like it's taking you longer, but it's really about the allocation of the time you're putting forward.
I think you're right, Brian. And I think what it is that there's a certain disequilibrium sometimes when teachers get started, and they have to really plan with UDL in mind. And so it feels more like that it's taking more time, but really, I think it's that disequilibrium. And they get over it pretty quickly, once they start seeing how successful it is, or they have to maybe go back and rework it a little bit, right? Sometimes that'll happen too.
I think it's that they have to learn how to work smarter, not harder.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think the piece of working smarter takes a while, because in working with educators and implementing this, and even district leadership, I mean, what they come to the table with initially isn't what they leave the table with. So they start thinking differently about the way we design for kids from the very beginning, and it empowers them to go about planning environments and learning experiences in a much smarter, intentional way. But it takes a while to do that. It takes a while to get to that mindset. And then after you do it, and you'll hear teachers, they have those sort of aha moments. Like they'll start off by saying, "Oh, I'm excited about this because this is why I went into education. This is what I thought it was going to be about," and that inspires them. And then they go into figuring out being able to go into an experience that maybe their colleagues' classroom or whatever, and they'll see interactions and stuff, and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I think we should think about this and this and this." And they think about it more as a learning designer or learning engineer or whatever you want to call it. And that's not something they did before, because they were just, as Brian was saying, we're going to do the unit. I'm going to stand up front. I'm going to do this thing. And some kids will get it. Some kids will not get it. And, and I'm going to have to help the kids that didn't get it. I'm going to have to deal with that later on. Right. And what it does is it changes things, but it takes a while to get into that mindset to see it in a smarter sort of way.
Well, I think that's part of the enculturation of education, right?
Yeah.
Like we are all experienced in some kind of compensatory education as students, and we spend a certain amount of time doing that. And it's been taught this very linear and very bureaucratic way, right? With gatekeepers of knowledge, right? And those gatekeepers might be resources, and those gatekeepers might be people, and they might be a ton of different things. But those stand in the way. And then we move into becoming teachers, and we're taught to be teachers based on the experiences that we had before, and thinking about those same kind of lessons that we saw, And what we want to do is we want to change like the engagement point of that lesson,
Yep.
but we're not really looking at like what's the deeper assumptions of that lesson and the deeper assumptions of what we know about students. And I think what UDL allows us to do is it throws a different frame. It throws a different frame on it. Like it throws a different, like people say lens, I say operating system. It throws something different into the mix, and that part is again that this equilibrium that Denise was talking about. And so it takes some time to get settled in that and to break that enculturation of pretty bureaucratic, linear, education that we've seen.
Yeah, it's spot on.
I'm hoping that from this conversation, teachers are inspired to implement UDL in their classrooms, but I'm also concerned about some who may not be really supported in doing that and what barriers they might face during implementation that might discourage them to revert back to not using UDL. So can you all maybe offer, one or two strategies that a new teacher or a teacher who is new to UDL can take toward using this framework in their classroom?
It's a lot of questions there.
Yeah, there's some big pieces there.
Yeah, I don't know who wants to take on this first.
I think I'm gonna take the pretty standard UDL answer, but then I'm gonna flip it a little bit. Okay. I think that one of the big things that teachers, educators need to look at is they need to look at their goals, right, and those student goals, and really you can't really put a design forward without it having some kind of goal. But what we tend to do in education is that we're not really making student goals. What we're really talking about is we're talking about our agendas. Right. And I don't mean like our social agendas, and I don't mean like our political agendas. We're talking about our to-do list. Like I have to get through this curriculum. That's not a student goal. That's not on teachers. Like, I don't want to see the comments blow up and say this dude hates teachers. That's not what that is. That is a system that pushes that. Right. And so that system pushes an agenda instead of asking the goal question of what do my students need to leave here knowing, and what do they need to leave here like learning today? Like what are we actually taking in as new information, synthesizing, getting down to those deeper levels of knowledge and understanding? That's the real question, and that's the goal portion. But what we often have is the curriculum agenda, which tells us I've got to get to this pacing by this time, right? And there may not be this time for enrichment. So I think that what systems need to, or what, if you walk into a UDL classroom, you'll see students that are actually exploring and asking the questions about like, why do I understand what I understand? Like that whole, like that theory of knowledge and that metacognition of why do I believe what I believe? Why do I understand what I understand? And how do I offer that up in different ways? And I think that starts with really reframing our concept of what goals are.
I think is
that okay? Was that okay, guys?
I think, so I'll give something, the assumption of the question is that the teacher knows about UDL or doesn't know about it. Like they understand what UDL is, or they don't understand what UDL is.
Let's take it from both directions.
Okay. So
interested in UDL, they want to implement it, but they're not really sure where to start.
Okay. Well, I'll give you a practical thing, right? I guess I can share my screen. I've not tried it here, but we'll see. Can I do that here? Let's see.
Go for it.
Share screen. Let's see how this works, everyone. So I will share this screen here. So one of the things you can do right away is you can go to Learning Designed. And Learning Designed is I'll blow it up here so people can see it probably a little bit better. Learning Designed is a platform. It's a global platform for people in the UDL community to collaborate and work with one another and develop understanding and learn from one another. So whether you're in the US or beyond, there's resources here for you to do that. But even if you just go into this resource area, and now I've not tried this lately, so it's kind of scary. I'm doing this live, right? But there's a whole bunch of stuff on getting started. And I just typed in getting started, right? So that's one thing you can do to get started. Another thing you can do is, as a community, we've kind of come together to develop a series of stackable micro-credentials so that if you just want to really learn about UDL, you can sign up and get a micro-credential. And you can start at the very beginning. Quite literally, it says start at the beginning, right? And you can start at the beginning and learn about UDL and have the micro-credential. Now, if I go there, it's going to say, yeah, it costs you $30, et cetera. But you can even scroll down and say, you don't want to spend that kind of money, right? It's not that much money, but there's even a mini course that you can go to that can help walk you through some of the pieces that you might need to know to get started in the mini course. And so you can get a free account, log in, and there's a mini course, right? And no, I'm not going to do where I left off. I'm going to start over again. And so there's some opportunity there. So again, it's just going into learning design and beginning your journey there. That's one way to do it. That's one little thing to do.
I think another thing, and I'm just going to add on to what Jamie and Brian were saying, is I do think teachers should not continue to try to do this in a solo way. It is really better if you do this as a school team or as a school as a whole. And I think it's important the first thing that you really need to do is sit down with your team, your principal, whatever, and ask yourself, what is our current educational framework? What is it? And help each other articulate that, and then begin talking and learning more about what UDL really is, and then really decide as a team, how do our current school initiatives really fit within this UDL framework? Because you're going to see that it's not something new and different. It's not something else. It's not the next popular thing down the road. UDL has been around for a long time now. But you really need to have a solid, I think, view of how this fits within your ecosystem, educational ecosystem.
I think too, like to that point, when you're talking to administrators and such, and they're concerned about laws and rules and all this kind of stuff, what you have to recognize is UDL is central to the law of land, right? So it's Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, it's primary to that law, and it actually is required in supporting environments that are aligned to UDL and things like literacy. And I know Florida's done a great job at adopting some of this and talking about some of this, and where we're at in the adoption process. And there's varying levels of adoption. We can get into that, but there's that sort of policy adoption, like we've adopted as a policy, right? But then what we really need to do is get on the ground and support that adoption through these rich conversations with administrators and working on our own self-development or seeking development. And so there's ways to do that. But talking to administrators about ESSA as a federal law, and within the state of Florida, if you're in the state of Florida, talking about where it's rolled into the guidelines around the state of Florida.
Yeah.
What are some challenges?
Denise, I'm sorry, go ahead.
What are some challenges that you've seen teachers come upon when they're trying to implement UDL, and how do they overcome them?
Start off too large.
Yeah. Bite off more than they can chew.
Try to boil the ocean.
Yeah, they want to do everything because as teachers, we feel like we should, and we know it's the right thing to do for students. And so we take on too much, and then we realize we can't sustain it on our own. So we all say start small. Like, if you're looking at the guidelines, for instance, maybe start with engagement or start with something where, start small. That's one I see all the time.
Yeah.
Do an audit of one of your lessons, the lesson that you think you're killing it in, like the lesson that every kid is every learner is like, I'm jacked to be and stoked to be on this lesson. The one that your favorite lesson, take a look at it and say, do I have on-ramps for engagement? Do I have on-ramps for ways for students to present their information to me? Do I have on-ramps for presenting information in different ways? Take an inventory. Then take that lesson that is the killer lesson, right? It's the lesson that you're not even a teacher anymore. You're a dentist because you spend all your time pulling teeth, right? To get through it. Take that lesson and say, do I have these engagement pieces? Do I have these same on-ramps to engagement, these on-ramps to action and expression, these on-ramps to representation and materials to my students? Start taking an audit of those things is what I would think, that's one way to start. and then start thinking about how can I put those in, right? I think that that's, you know, Joy Zabala once said to me, she said, you know, UDL sometimes is hard because it's like trying to boil the ocean. And I think that that's, you know, that makes complete sense to me. You'll never get there with it. I think that it's, you know, it's not about boiling the ocean. It's about finding the little pieces and where do those go, and kind of, you know, moving those on ramps.
And it seems like something that teachers can start in the middle of a semester or a school
Oh
year.
yeah,
They don't need to wait
there
for.
is no starting point. Yeah, there's no beginning. There's no seasonal starting point on this.
Yeah, there's no starter kit, right? That says you start at this time and you move to this, you know, like. And I think that sometimes that throws people off. I think one of the big issues is people are like, there's so much. I have this paradox of choice, right? Like there's like, it's the paradox of choice because I want to give my kids every choice. And I wonder, like, part of that framing is, am I giving them options, or am I giving them things that are just interesting, right? Like if I can, you know, so I think that talking about what real options are, and I think that understanding that you can give just three things, right? And if those three things hit, and they hit well with students, and you feel as though you are giving them those on ramps, that's a good place. Now what happens when I add four? Now what happens when I ask for student voice around it,
Mm.
right? And then I reflect on that piece.
Yeah, and I think that reflection piece is what I was going to build on with Brian, and that's an important piece in UDL, is really not only reflecting on your abilities to implement UDL, but really reflecting on what UDL brings to your students and allowing them to really talk about it in the context of your lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that educators, we feel like that's where we want to be, right? Like nobody got really got into education to say, you know, why I got here is I want to punish some kids, right? Like I want them to hate math, and I want to punish them, and I want to see their tears. That's what I live off of, is student tears. No teacher got in to do that, right? So I think that, like, we want them to be reflective, and we want to move them towards that reflection and that personal, you know, like that efficacy. And I think that that's part of it. I'm sorry, Jamie, I jumped in on you, man.
No, I think you're right there. I mean, I'm trying to think of the things that we continue to run into in working with teachers on this, and it all comes down to the same thing. It's once we get them over that hump of thinking differently and thinking smarter about the way they do, it's then saying they want to take on too much, and then they can't sustain it. But it's giving them the ability to say, look, I'm going to start small and redesign, and then move through it. You know, but one of the points of reflection is critical. I mean, one of the first things you can do, like, do it tomorrow. One of the things you do tomorrow, and I know people are in varying settings, online, you know, face-to-face, remote, hybrid, whatever we're going to call it. I mean, I want you to just take some time and think about who's being left out, who's not in the conversation, who's not engaged, and then think about why they're not engaged, right? And it could be the kid that's not engaged. It could be a bunch of kids that are not engaged, because across our great land, we've had a bunch of kids that are not showing up to school. And we're assuming they're not showing up to school because they don't want to be there, right? But there's more to it than that. There could be many, many reasons. It could be from basic stuff such as internet. It could be like they got to take care of their siblings, all these different things. Now then think about, how do we redesign to get all those kids back? How do we get those kids engaged? And what do we have to do to make that happen? And UDL would start that very process of thinking about, okay, what are the barriers here? How do I overcome those barriers? If the goal is to get these kids back engaged in school, what's it actually mean? How do I do it? And that's what we've been challenged with since really January or whatever, since I got our first call from overseas about, oh, we got this virus. But I think, you know, these are things that we need to be thinking about.
And I would even push it and say that it's not just engagement, it's investment, right? And I think that it's students being able to invest the right kind of currency. If you don't have the money to invest, you can't invest. And so I think that we as educators need to start asking, what's the investment that we want our students to start putting in, and are we naming what we want them to put in? So if it's just academic knowledge that we want them to put in, or academic currency to put in, that leaves a lot of kids out. But if we're asking, like, what what are some of the cultural pieces that you know from your home? How does that affect things? That's a type of currency that I can invest as a student, right? Or my walk of life, or whatever it may be, right? How do I start designing things for students to add their own kind of investments, and how am I asking for more like bigger and broader kind of scope of investment from students? And that's engagement, right?
Mhm.
And not chasing the fact that students should always be engaged, right? Like if you're out there right now and you're watching this video, you may not be engaged. You may be looking on Amazon right now, trying to buy yourself something. I say go ahead. You deserve it. You work hard, right? If you need a vacation, take one. But when you come back, when you re-engage, when you come back, be with us, right? And I think that we don't allow students to do that either. We often say, it's my job as a teacher to keep you engaged all the way through this task and all the way through 90 minutes. Yikes. For
Well,
both people, for both groups, right? Yikes.
yeah, because it's one of the number one things you do for engagement, and decades of research has shown this. If you want to engage your students, you want to increase engagement, decrease off-task behavior, give them some autonomy, give them some choice, build it into the way you plan the lesson, the unit, the learning experience. That's a simple thing. Give them some choice in what they do and how they do it, and how they adopt it into who they are as in who they are and what they're interested in doing. Number one thing you can do, there's decades of research on it. Decades of research on it. And that is central to how we can start thinking about UDL in the classroom.
Yeah, that is central to UDL.
I think it's also a question of bounded autonomy, because if you tell, like, I gotta be honest with you, if you give first graders a bunch, like, nothing but choice and freedom, that's scary. That turns into pretty quick, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's about bounded autonomy. I think that, like, there are areas, like, you can give students autonomy around the space that they're in, or you can give them autonomy around the task that needs to be done, or the way that task needs to be done, or how they build their team. But anytime you start, and there's some things you can't, like, look, I can't give you autonomy around us completing this exam. Now, I may be able to give you different choices about how that exam comes, how you see that, but I can't give you a choice of whether you want to do it today or you want to do it in 3 months, right? So I have to bound some of that autonomy within the rules, but there are some pieces that I can give you that say how you go about doing this task,
Yeah.
right, is up to you, or who you do it with is up to you, or where you sit is up to you, right? But there are certain things that I hold fast, and that's really a social agreement that you're starting to make with your class, with your learners, and you as an educator.
Yeah, and then remember, you're teaching them how to learn, right? So not only just giving them choice and giving them bounded autonomy, but thinking aloud with them as to why, and help facilitate that understanding about why those choices are being made,
Right.
and how they contribute to their learning, right? How they contribute or not to their learning, and why it's important. Because
and how it contributes to them as in the development of being expert learners.
Yeah,
Go ahead, James.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I want to conclude our conversation today by making this very tangible for teachers and kind of casting a vision. So, what changes do you notice in classrooms when teachers start incorporating UDL? What changes are in students? What can they expect to see?
Can I start that, guys?
Oh, absolutely.
All
Yeah.
right. I am going to now share my screen. Let's see. See if this works here. Is it sharing yet?
Not yet. It's not.
Okay, let's see. Application window. There we go. Now is it sharing?
Nope.
All right, that's not good. All right, I can't really. All right, here we go. Share screen.
Yep.
All right, let me try the entire screen. Share the entire screen and see if that works. Nope. All right, one more time. No. Jamie, what was your secret?
I don't know. I hit share screen and told it what I was looking at a tab and just said, go to this tab. But
It said, go to this tab. I went to,
yeah, I don't know.
huh.
We could just talk about it though.
All right, we can talk about it. Let me see if that works. Just stream it that way. No, it doesn't want to share. Okay. All right, so I'll just talk about it then. So, because it would just have been easier with this slide, but that's okay. So, one of the things I think we learned about implementing in schools, and we when we were doing this, we started this about, I don't know, about 15 years ago. So, but I'm retired from that district now. But we found our job was to try to systematically try to make this happen one school at a time. And one of the things we found is that the things that we saw in the first few years is that we really needed to give people permission to experiment with what works and what doesn't. And it's very important to set that up in a way that feels acceptable to everyone. What we saw in the first year were lots of emerging patterns of best practices by teachers who are implementing UDL, increased confidence in the implementation of UDL. And we also focused with teachers on documenting their success and building the capacity across the school. So we'd start with a few classrooms and then we'd build it across the schools. So the kinds of trends that we saw in the first year is that the first thing that often teachers did when they realized they were going to move into UDL is they would really take a hard look at the way their classroom was organized, arranged. So they might start there because they realized they needed different kinds of setups within their classroom to make UDL happen in a more pragmatic way. So teachers started to, we found them really starting to develop routines for their own personal planning of UDL lessons, for managing those lessons, all within the UDL framework. Over time, we saw teachers build their repertoire of using new tools to carry these things out, to carry out UDL, and using new strategies to implement UDL. And what we found at the end of the first year is that teachers were much more comfortable with providing students with a range of choices and setting up the routines for choices within that classroom. And it became a more natural part of the instructional process. So there was kind of a growth mindset of taking risks, reflecting on what's working and what's not working, sharing questions and ideas with peers. And that's what we would typically see in the first year. And then the outcomes of that first year were typically we would see fewer behavioral issues in the classroom. That was always the thing that teachers would speak to first. And then more time, and students would spend more time on task when given more choices of how they want to either receive or present new information. So more time on task. Even the kids who were typically always, in the principal's office or being kicked out into the hallway were the ones who were way more engaged. But that was typical for many of the kids in the classroom. Students with learning disabilities often felt less isolated because the strategies that you were carrying out worked for everyone because of the choices that were integrated into the classroom. So they were less isolated, less set apart for special accommodations. And that to me was just a wonder to see that happen even in the first year. In the second year, what we saw is the much more of a decreased need for the teachers to be in control, to be upfront and presenting and to be in control of every aspect of the lesson. They really started to focus more on how they could help their students become more expert learners. And again, they shifted more towards the planning of good instruction, as well as integrating that within the content, whatever academic content they were working on. And then the last thing that I would speak to in the second year is that something to encourage, but something also seemed to happen naturally, is that increasingly those teachers became seen as leaders and as resources in their school buildings. So that was something that we promoted, but it took on kind of it just sort of happened naturally. Teachers would talk about it in the lunchroom or whatever. This lesson really worked well for me because this is how I did it. So there was a greater understanding of the importance of dedicating time towards relationship building with students in that second year. That was really, really quite beautiful. So, and the kinds of things that we often saw in year 2 is teachers, a greater willingness to take risks, learning risks in the classroom, and on the part of students, a greater willingness to take learning risks in the classroom, to really extend themselves, to stretch themselves. More increased confidence and increased comfort with teacher to peer, peer to teacher, and peer to peer dialogue about learning choices. So even in second grade classrooms, we would find kids say, well, I learn it this way, but you might learn it best this way. So there was this very intentional conversation that got incorporated into classrooms. We saw students take more personal responsibility for their personal learning choices. Instead of it being the teacher's job to impart learning, they started to take more responsibility for those learning choices and making sure that those choices really worked for them. And then I think engagement. I mean, you just begin to see increases in student engagement, and an investment in personalizing their own learning. So those were just some of the things I wanted to share that we saw in from year 1 and year 2. All right, I'll hand it over.
Is there anything left? That was
yeah. How do you follow that up, Denise?
Come on, I know you guys can do it.
Thanks for leaving something for the rest of us.
Go for it, guys.
I think it's disposition. I don't, like you walk in and oftentimes when we say, like, what are we looking for? What is a big change that we see? We think environmental, and there might be some environmental changes, right? Like there might be flexible furniture, there might be areas or zones of learning and where those things happen. And like, this is our collaboration zone. This is our, this is our directed teaching zone. This is our design zone, like whatever those may be. You may see those changes, but I think the biggest changes that I see both in educators and teachers are dispositional changes, purpose and intent changes, right? Like I'm purposeful in the way that I speak. Like Denise just said, I mean, really imagine second graders talking about learning in this very metacognitive way of like, this is how I learn it, but you might learn it differently. That's a massive realization for students. And so then those students who have traditionally not thought of themselves as students and have been stigmatized, like have fallen into that stigmatization of I'm not a good learner. Right? Like they all of a sudden have an investment. That's that engagement piece. And so I think, and then, that idea of moving from stage on the stage to guide on the side, whatever cool little, like, rhyme you want to put it to, those teachers working as facilitators and guides, and allowing students to share their power that they already have. I mean, let's be honest, right? Like inherently, we as educators are not really in charge of learning, the actual act of learning. Like we provide environments and enrichment and scaffold that learning and help structure it. But the actual act of learning, me taking it in, applying it to my life is mine. And it always will be mine. Right? So why not share that power? Why not recognize it?
Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah. I think one of the things, and it depends on, of course, the context and the environment in which it's being implemented. But oftentimes, at least oftentimes I'm getting called in to work with schools that are going through transformational change, low performing, moving, and they realize they've got a problem and they're trying to move the needle on that. And some of the early, I mean, everything everyone said already, but one of the other things we see is that it forms a learning community. And what I mean by that is it does obviously within your school, it brings forth a conversation around learning around professionals. And it brings forth around the design of the environment among the professionals, right? But it also, the doors that were shut are now open. And we've all been in those schools. You may work in one of those schools now, right? Where you go to a school and the door's shut every day, and there's no interaction during the day, and that changes. You walk into the building, and that's a noticeable change pretty quickly when it starts being adopted at the school level. But then beyond the school grounds and the professionals on the school grounds, and we've heard about the students are engaged in this conversation because you're bringing student voice and everything. But the other thing that we've seen is you bring forth the family engagement, right? We bring forth that family investment and engagement that maybe many of the schools are missing. And I can recall stories I can recall like the first whole school change process we went through many moons ago now. It's probably 12 or so, 14 or so years ago. But I remember holding a PTA, PTO sort of meeting and one parent showing up the first day we were there, right? And we're working through this. We're going to create this UDL aligned STEM school, right? And we had one parent show up. And I could tell you what, by the end of that semester, we had 20, 30 parents showing up. By the end of that year, we had 50 parents showing up. 3 or 4 years later, we're having hundreds of parents show up. So it's about designing a learning community. And that school in particular, that area that we were working in, what we currently realized was in developing that learning community, it was more than just the K-12 learners, right?
Yeah.
That we had this facility that was being empty on weekends and yet had tools and stuff there for engaging the community. They said, hey, we'd like to learn some of the things our students are learning. We'd like to learn computer skills. We'd like to learn, and so then now it's truly turned into a learning community that's really kind of engaging and helping not only the barriers within our K-12 learners, right? But let's help overcome some of the barriers we're facing as a society. And so it really can transform things in a manner that if it's fully adopted.
And I want to add to that, just so that you can picture this a little bit more, that it's not just about the K-12 teachers either. We had art teachers who incorporated this. We had physical education teachers who took this on as a challenge and started to incorporate more UDL into how they teach PE. So it's not just your academic classroom teachers, and I think that's important. That just sort of, I think, adds to what Jamie was saying about the school community.
Yeah, we always get, I know we're getting on time. The question I used to get if I have to go talk to a leadership team is, will it raise our test scores?
Yeah.
Everyone's always worried about their test scores. And I said, look, the test scores themselves are exhausting to learning. They're exhaust, right? So it's not something we actually have to aim for, because it should be something that comes forth and should be something that's external to that. So our goal isn't to raise test scores, right? I know some people are focused on that, but does that come out as a consequence? Yeah, probably. Is it if it emerges and goes into the air? Yeah, your test scores are going to raise, and doing that. But really, what we're going for is transforming the environment, transforming the way we think about learning for all kids from the very beginning. And that's really what we're aiming for.
That is an excellent conclusion to a phenomenal conversation. And really a phenomenal series. I mentioned at the beginning that UDL is something that has been brought up in each of our broadcasts prior to this discussion. So it's so perfect to have you all wrap up this series. Thank you for your time and your expertise this evening. I also wanted to thank our audience for submitting questions. And if you weren't able to get an answer to your specific question, you can email tjeei@ucf.edu. You can follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter as well. And we will make sure that we get your questions answered. And we really hope that you all have enjoyed this series. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Dashawn.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Bye, guys. See you later, Brian and Jamie.
See ya.